This is what a synagogue would have looked like in the days of Jesus. This is where he would have taught at. Although I do believe that this particular one was actually built back on top of the ruins of the one Jesus taught in, nonetheless, it gives you an idea. It would have been a small building, and whoever was reading from the scroll would have sat up front, so there wouldn't have been a ton of room for people here. It was a very small, intimate gathering. Today's teaching, we're going to be dealing with elders, bishops, and deacons. We're going to answer the question, what are they? And then we're going to answer the question, should every local assembly of believers have them? And if so, why? A few things we need to know up front before we get started is that any leadership needs to be a Christ-like example. And two passages should be sufficient to show this. One is 2 Corinthians 1:12, where the Apostle Paul is talking to the church at Corinth, and he said, I'm going to paraphrase, he said, we have a clear conscience how we acted towards you. He said, we behaved with simplicity and godly sincerity. We didn't use earthly wisdom to try to convince you about the Messiah, but by the grace of God, we acted excellently towards you. That's how Paul said that him and those who ministered with him to the Corinthians, that's how they behaved themselves. The second thing is in 1 Timothy 4:12. For those of you who don't know, the Apostle Paul, he had this spiritual son named Timothy. And this is the instruction he gave him as he was in leadership at this church in what's called Ephesus. He says, don't let anybody despise you because you're young. He says, but be an example. He says, be an example in your speech. And a few more things that we need to discuss right up front. According to Strong's Outline of Biblical Usage, and many other commentators and resources, the New Testament uses the term bishop, elder, and presbyters interchangeably. And there's some argument that actually the word pastor may have been synonymous at one point with bishop. The second thing we need to address is that we're primarily focusing on elders, but we'll also address bishops and deacons along with it, almost as a side thought. And lastly, I mentioned this up front, but it's important enough to say again, when we use these terms, elder, bishop, deacon, presbyter, overseer, we're not using this term as any modern Christian religious organization uses them. We're only looking at how the New Testament uses these terms, and we're going to stick with that only. Okay, so what are elders? Are they people that are advanced in age? Are they only for certain denominations? The first place we see the word used in the New Testament is actually Matthew 15. That's a terrific place to start, because we need to understand that there's a big difference between the way Jewish people saw elders and the way that the New Testament church saw elders. I'm just going to sum this up, and I've got a lot more teaching on this if you need the resource. The Jewish elders were those that were advanced in age. They were responsible for handing down the oral traditions. Now, we all know that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, have the law of God for the Jewish people. But there were oral traditions that were passed down. All that means is that they verbally handed down instructions that were eventually organized into a book. Basically, the elders and their traditions were what caused so many problems for Jesus, because that's generally what he was defying, was the tradition. I'm just going to give you an example of this. Here in the South, it's very common courtesy to take your hat off while people are praying, or while you're sitting at a dinner table. Now, you may not catch quite as much flack in modern day because of it, but some years ago, I imagine you would have got the hat slapped off your head if you tried to sit down with it. People were very touchy about that subject. Now, if that had been something the whole community accepted as truth without exception, then you could have said, wow, the elders are elderly that have handed down this information for us has become almost like a law that we have to live by. That's essentially what was happening in the days of Jesus. Okay, so it kind of gives us an idea of what elders were in a New Testament sense. But is that what they were in the New Testament church? Well, the first place we see the word elders in connection with the church is in Acts 11:29. It's when Agabus and some other prophets came down to Antioch from Judea. They were telling about a worldwide famine, you may remember that. And the disciples in Antioch determined to send some relief money to those that were living in Judea. It was collected by Paul and Barnabas, and it was sent to the elders. Now, in this sense, the church elders were those who received it, and they would have divvied it out. They would have been trustworthy, those that could be trusted with money. See, there's very specific criteria for the selection of elders, and we're going to get into that a little bit as we go. Let's look at Acts 14:23 because it gives us a little better example of elders. After Paul and Barnabas had made disciples in Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch, they appointed elders for them in every church. This actually answers question 4. Should every church have identified elders? Well, the early church did in every instance. And by the way, there was no elder, it was elders. There were always multiple appointees. They were selected from among the people. So here's some criteria for the selection of elders, according to Paul in Titus. They need to be above reproach. Now, what does that mean? Basically, they needed to have a good reputation and be a good example of Christ-likeness. They needed to be the husband of one wife. They needed to have faithful children, not children who were drunkards and lived a wild lifestyle of partying and whatnot, but children that were not rebellious either. Here's some more selection criteria that the elders had to meet regardless of whether they were bishop or deacon. They couldn't be, I'm just going to rattle these off, okay? Not arrogant, quick-tempered, a drunkard, violent, greedy for gain, but they must be hospitable, lovers of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. They must hold firmly to the trustworthy word as was taught by the apostles. Basically, the doctrine that Paul delivered to the disciples, an elder among them had to be able to represent it and defend it. We may have mentioned this before, but I want to sum it up a little better here. Elders can't possibly mean just those advanced in age. The elder person would have had to meet the qualifications for being appointed. What happens if you have people that are older, but they don't meet the qualifications? Well, you still need elders. So somebody has to be appointed. I think that's why we see that Timothy was a young man, and there's instructions to him not to harshly rebuke an elder person. You still need to respect everybody, but we respect our elders as well. There's a little bit more information about elders that would come in handy for us. In the book of Timothy, Paul tells Timothy, don't be too quick to lay hands on somebody. Now, that term means something different today. I'm going to lay hands on you. Just to explain that, it seems to be there was some type of transference of authority or giftings or whatnot, because several times in the New Testament we see examples of after they had prayed, they put their hands on them, laid their hands on them, their shoulders or the head or whatever, and they prayed for them and appointed them to a position of leadership. All right, so let's summarize this. Every church had elders appointed. Elders and bishops are really the same title, and so is presbyter. All right, anytime you see that. Deacons seem to have been those that were more responsible, for instance, in Acts chapter 6, of a feeding ministry where they had the obligation of providing for others with the donations from the saints that were given. So they probably had more responsibility financially. Whereas bishops probably were more along the lines of pastors and teachers. Some elders or bishops or overseers worked very hard at preaching and teaching. I mentioned that before. Preaching is external, teaching is internal. And they were considered worthy of double honor, whatever that meant at the time. All right. Here's a few notes that I want to mention from a teaching I watched from Koinonia House by Chuck Missler. To preach and teach was the primary task of elders. You can find that in 1 Timothy 4:6, 1 Timothy 5:17, 2 Timothy 2:15, or in Titus 2:1. Thanks so much for joining me today. We will do part 4 next week, Friday, same time, 3 p.m. on our YouTube channel, and we'll link that in Facebook as well. We're going to teach finally on the assembly itself. I cannot wait to get into that. I've been looking forward to this now for 3 weeks, and it'll be 4 weeks before I get a chance to actually talk about us and our role in the local gathering. So hopefully you'll be able to join me for that.